Hello, my name is Elena Miskinis, and I'm an undergraduate at Kent State University majoring in English, piano performance, and psychology, and studying with Dr. Joshua Albrecht in the Music Cognition Lab. Today I will present an exploratory content analysis on how 19th century music critics used figurative language to describe the instrumental music they were reviewing. A boat visiting by moonlight the wild places of the Vierwaldsee in Switzerland. This is how in 1830 German poet and music critic Ludwig Rellstab, not the composer, described the opening movement of one of the most famous pieces in all of classical music literature. To this day, this is so exclusively referred to as the Moonlight Sonata, even a pianist might take an extra few seconds to remember which one is Beethoven Piano Sonata Opus 27 No. 2. Using figurative words to describe the perceptual experience of music is a phenomenon musicologists, critics, and pedagogues practice fluently. For example, in almost any lesson, coaching, masterclass, or rehearsal, students are accustomed to hearing the common question, "What is the character of this piece?" Yet, how can any music listener accurately interpret that a piece of music sounds like moonlight, or why not sunlight? Davies 2006 suggested the doggy theory, that music imitates an emotional experience. Later, Robinson and Hatton in 2012 further proposed the persona theory, that listeners adopt a conscious or subconscious character that develops throughout the piece. Yet, how can a linguistic description evoke a sound without even hearing it? Perhaps synesthesia, the psychological crossing of the senses, and Aristotle's fantasia, or stimulating images, provide some explanation. Like Rellstab, many music critics of the 19th century used figurative language to evoke their perceptions of the music to those who had not yet heard it. For this study, we selected a corpus of 21 different music periodicals published in the English language during the 19th century. Some titles included The Message Bird, Dwight's Journal of Music, and The Musical Times. For each decade of each periodical's run, we randomly selected 5 pages that critique orchestral music, including concerti, chamber music, no more than an octet, organ pieces, and piano compositions, written during the Baroque, Classical, or Romantic eras. For each page of music criticism, we extracted all metaphors describing the musical composition and excluding any references to a specific performance or a composer in general. In addition, we excluded several analytical terms such as movement or technical descriptions of sound, like harmonious or sonorous. Here is an example of how we extracted the metaphors. It comes from the Quarterly Musical Magazine, published in 1825, and was written on Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, or the New Symphony as they called it. For instance, we extracted the metaphors lively, flows, pleasing, and a lengthy one comparing the music to the aurora borealis. Notice also at the bottom where it says melodious, we excluded this word as it pertains directly to music. Despite these kind comparisons, the critic in fact nearly abhorred this piece, claiming it to be way too long and, quote, not compensated by any beauty or unity of design. After collecting 125 pages from 21 periodicals, which included 2,780 metaphors, we created this beautiful word cloud, which shows the frequency of the words based on size. Now, one thing to note is that certain forms of the metaphors were simplified to create the same word tense or part of the speech. For example, pleasing could also have been pleasure or pleased or please. From this jumbled but pleasingly brilliant word cloud, we performed a content analysis to sort all of the different metaphors based on metaphor type, instrumentation, the year of criticism, and musical time period. Originally, we were planning to use J.M. Williams' 1976 synesthetic metaphor coding, which included the 5 senses plus color and dimension. However, as this chart demonstrates, synesthetic metaphors actually only accounted for 36.5% of the data. The other two main categories that emerged related to personification at 42.3% and extended metaphors, or what we called imagery, at 21.2%. Further examination also revealed numerous subcategories, with the most frequent again coming from personification under the subcategory characteristic, followed by affect and pastoral imagery. Now let's look at each category more closely. The largest main category, personification, included anything relating generally to a person. The largest subcategory we labeled characteristic, which related to character, emotions, personality, and temperament, and included words such as curious and happy. Secondly, the subcategory affect related to how music is affecting the audience with words such as charming and pleasing. Action was verbs describing the movement of a person such as run and gather. Speech referred to talking such as plaintive and coherent. Human life referred to natural functions or parts of the body, such as breath and feeling. Lastly, contemplation included words relating to thinking, like reflective and reminisce. Now let's listen to an excerpt from Liszt's Tasso Lamento e Trionfo, an orchestral work which the music critic describes as plaintive, slow, mournfully monotonous, and irremediable sadness. See if you can hear it when you listen. The smallest main category, imagery, includes anything that alludes to a specific object or concept. The largest subcategory was pastoral imagery, including words like lightning and gallop. Secondly, the subcategory civilization related to the structure of society, relationships, and cultures, with words such as couples and germain. Religious imagery included piety and prayer. Fantasy imagery included illusion and enchanting. Death imagery included funeral and devil, and food included treat and champagne. Imagery also had a large subcategory alluding to other art forms, including literature such as poetic, dance such as jig, clothing such as interwoven, architecture such as columns, sculpture such as statuesque, visual art such as shading, and music, including references to other composers or other instruments like Beethovenial and singing. Now let's listen to an excerpt from the second movement of Beethoven's Sixth Symphony, nicknamed the Pastoral Symphony. Try to imagine these descriptors when you listen: still forest, rippling brook, splashing water, and bird songs. Before I describe the synesthetic category, I want to point out that every metaphor is a synesthetic metaphor in a way. When you think about it, a metaphor is comparing one thing to another, so each is inherently different yet understood in the same way. Much like Aristotle's hierarchy of senses, Cacciari 2008 distinguishes between the higher senses of audition and vision and the lower cutaneous and touch senses, which are often used to describe the higher senses. In this study, the synesthesia category is comprised of the lower senses, while personification and imagery are comprised of the higher senses. Synesthesia, as the most complex category, manifested several subcategories, the largest being quality, which referred to broadly the value, such as rich. Appearance included beautiful and dimension included deep. Composition related to how the parts in a whole compare, such as diverse and simple. Light referred to color and how the light acted, such as reflected and brilliant. Strength included weight, time included slowly, and motion included to burst. Taste included sweet, proximity included crowded, texture included smooth, and sound included clang. Interaction represented how two things associated, such as rival and contrast, Acuteness referred to how strong the perception was, such as subtle and vague. Lastly, temperature included warm and frigid, and quantity included profuse and scarce. Now let's listen to an excerpt from the third movement of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. Try to imagine these descriptors as written by a music critic when you listen. Liquid sweetness, simple and plain. After creating the metaphor categories, we sorted the metaphors based on decade of publication. The graph on the right shows the amount of metaphors collected from each decade. The 1830s are so underrepresented because the journals did not contain any metaphors or were not within the constraints of this study. The density plot on the left again shows the general trend of mostly personifying metaphors. However, around the 1850s, imagery noticeably increases, perhaps related to the high representation of metaphors in Beethoven's orchestral works during this decade. Next, we sorted the metaphors based on instrumentation. On the left, you can see the amount of metaphors we collected for each instrument, and the graph on the right demonstrates the same overall pattern of personifying metaphors being the most prevalent. The same was also true for the different musical eras, although the Baroque did have slightly more synesthetic metaphors than personification. Closer examination of highly represented composers shows that Mendelssohn, Schubert, and Bach had slightly more synesthetic metaphors, while Liszt and Beethoven had the much more personifying metaphors. Unlike the others, Beethoven also had a large amount of imagery metaphors, perhaps accounted for by his orchestral works, such as the Pastoral Symphony. Ultimately, with the consistent prevalence of personifying metaphors, results support Robinson and Hatton's persona theory that the listeners adopt a conscious or subconscious character in the music. While this exploratory content analysis provides one taxonomy for describing how music can evoke descriptors, it does not address how performers or listeners translate words into music. One future direction of this research could observe how musicians change their playing based on different metaphors. In particular, we could focus on the personification category, which is reminiscent of emotion and personality studies, as well as Hefner's categorization of affect descriptors. Linguistic studies could also reveal interesting patterns with particular sounds. Köhler, 1947, was one of the first to investigate this idea of linguistic sounds carrying inherent semantics. In the experiment, participants were asked to match each shape to the word maluma or takiti. Most people said that maluma, which has all voiced consonants, was the shape with the round edges, and takiti, which has all unvoiced consonants, was the shape with the jagged edges. More recently, Wallmark 2018 demonstrated a similar connection between linguistic and timbral studies. However, beyond personality and linguistic studies, my primary goals for the future of this research pertain to learning and memory in musical performance. For example, to help with learning, we can intentionally associate metaphors with the notes. Similarly, having an overload of information to think about when on stage can help distract the performer away from the notes and anxiety. Lastly, I want to explore how teachers use metaphors to describe the sound they want to hear. Sometimes this can even include metaphors to describe a certain kinesthetic movement to produce the sound. I remember a piano lesson when my teacher wanted the final chord to have a deeper sound. She told me to feel like I was sinking into an ocean. But when that didn't work, she told me to sink into molasses or honey, and suddenly my tone was completely different. Here's a word cloud I made of many of the metaphors she has used with me just in the past year. When I told her about it, she said, "Was there even enough room to fit all of them?" And there was definitely not. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation, and I look forward to your questions.